we'll do the live thing first. Like, hey everybody, welcome back to the Bigmark podcast. It's me, your host, Bigmark. If it's your first time listening, welcome. If not, welcome back. If you've heard us before, we always love to say, if you want to support the podcast, go check us out at our Patreon, patreon.com/thebigmarkpod. You can also get a hold of us, or comment, or, let us know if you want to hear a new topic for a show, on our Twitter or Instagram at the Bigmark Pod and at the Bigmark Podcast. And yeah, like I said, if you do have any ideas, we'd love to hear from you. Our one of our good buddies, Matt Norman and Mike Norman, have both kind of reached out, and it's great to hear ideas from them. And again, it's always good to hear from everyone who listens, and I'm always kind of surprised on who's listening too, because I kind of get some of the feedback or whatever to see how many people are listening to the podcast and all that good stuff, but I don't always get to see exactly who. So it's always a little bit of a surprise to see who's actually listening. And like I said, shout out to everyone all over the world who's been listening. And, I'm really grateful for everyone who's been listening. And it's been a really exciting journey and so far. And, I just love to keep doing these. And of course, just me and you today. So I thought I would pick a cool topic that, honestly, a lot of people have been talking about it. It's kind of resurging a little bit in the zeitgeist, if you will. I want to talk about The Sopranos. It's actually one of my favorite shows of all time. I'm so sorry, Scott Barker. But The Sopranos is one of my favorite shows of all time. If you knew me, when I go up to my buddy's cottage, my buddy Alan, shout out Alan. I won't mention your last name because I don't know if that's even allowed. I won't even go into any more of that. But anyway, shout out Big Al. We always just go off with Sopranos quotes and just annoys the hell out of everybody else because none of our other friends are really into the show, and it just doesn't make any sense. And I'll get into why it's probably really annoying. The show, especially the dialogue, can be like extremely real and extremely, I don't know. I don't even know if poignant's the word, but the way the dialogue is so so realistic that when you do end up quoting it, it always sounds strange. Sounds like you're just saying it, and then people aren't really understanding, and then you have to tell them it's a quote. Anyway, this is why it's annoying. But one of my favorite shows of all time. I've always suggested it as a great show. And I think, because of quarantine, a lot of people have kind of gone back to it and gone back to watch it. And, it was on in the late, late 90s. Its original air date was January 10th, 1999. It was on HBO. So not everyone had HBO. So it was only as accessible as it kind of could be at the time. Obviously, you had to pay for it. Now you still have to kind of pay for certain streaming services, but it's a little bit more common for people to just have access to them, especially with like the larger services like Crave and all of them that have all these different types of shows available. It was on for 6 seasons, so it went till June 10th, 2007. Obviously, during that time, like 9/11 happened. So there's like a super, since that point, there was a major kind of shift in Western culture, especially American culture, especially culture around New York City, which is where The Sopranos is kind of based in a lot, in New Jersey, mostly in New Jersey, but in that surrounding area around New York City, it just became such a different world after 9/11. The show reflects that in an interesting way. Obviously, it's pretty old now, right? Over 22 years ago, it aired, and it's only been it's only been about 14 years since it's been off the air. Or sorry, it's been 14 years, like not just 14 years, but since it's been off the air. And it's like, you know, very interesting in the fact that when you watch it again, and when I've gone to rewatch it, I've rewatched it over the last year or so, it's not as dated. Yeah, you kind of see different phones, like no one has smartphones and stuff, but like none of the dialogue is like overly dated. Some of the songs, and again, some of the costume is a little bit weird, but it's still so interesting. And the writing is phenomenal. You'll hear me talk about this a lot this podcast, but the writing is just tremendous. Very, very real. Again, the producers of the show, especially David Chase, who kind of created the show, he was the writer and producer of the show. One of the head writers, I should say, was meticulous in making sure that the show was real and accurate, and just had that certain feel to it. It's really did really well. So a little bit more about David Chase. Before The Sopranos, he was kind of known for the Rockford Files. He wasn't like extremely popular in TV or in Hollywood for that matter. Chase, his last name, the family name used to be DeCesare, and my grade, oh my gosh, I think senior kindergarten teacher was Miss DeCesare. Shut up, Miss DeCesare. So they changed that to Chase. And again, obviously a American Italian family. He kind of lived this life. A lot of the stuff that's in The Sopranos he had taken from his own life, and of course other mob stuff, and you know, and things like that. Actually, David Chase's daughter actually plays Hunter Scangarella in the show. She's Meadow, who's Tony Soprano's daughter's friend in the show. And in some of the scenes, Carmela Soprano, Tony's wife, refers to her as cacciatore, which in Italian means hunter. So like chicken cacciatore is like hunter's chicken or whatever. So if anyone was ever wondering why Carmela would call Hunter cacciatore, it's because that's what it means in Italian. Funny enough. So I don't want to go necessarily too far in the nitty gritty of the show. It's going to obviously come up how the show actually worked. You know, again, mob boss, life, going to therapy, family, dealing with all that stuff. And I don't really want to go too far into all the different actors, because there's so many tremendous actors and so many great characters and all that stuff. But I'd be remiss to not talk about Tony Soprano, obviously, and the man who played him, James Gandolfini. Tremendous actor. Was in a few movies, a handful of movies and TV shows before being on The Sopranos. But, you know, came from a strong acting background, actually went to Rutgers and got his Bachelor of Arts in Acting at Rutgers Acting School. When you see a show or movie or whatever, and you see an actor play a role that whether they are acting so well or however the casting went, that they just picked the perfect person, there's a moment where you kind of forget that they're acting anymore and that they are this character. And there's not too many other circumstances, either in this case, that Tony Soprano and James Gandolfini were the perfect match. From reports, obviously, you know, seeing director's cuts or whatever, interviews or like special features or stuff like that, anybody who talks about James Gandolfini says he was one of the nicest people ever. And it's really odd, and I guess it happens a lot. Some people who play like really horrible people on TV or in movies tend to be really nice people in real life. But again, just the acting ability that James Gandolfini had and what he was able to do with the character of Tony Soprano was just the perfect match, and you couldn't ask for more. Some of the movies he was in before Sopranos was True Romance, Crimson Tide, Get Shorty, and he kind of always played a big tough guy or like an enforcer or some kind of thing like that. So he had a little bit of experience doing that, but again, this character just was perfect for him. And again, the character of Tony Soprano is, on the outside, of course, this, mobster, tough guy, with anger issues, and, meanwhile, on the inside, he's conflicted about a lot of stuff. He had a lot of things happen in his childhood. He's dealing with his family at home. He's dealing with his family at work with organized crime. Obviously the threat of jail, the threat of all these different things looming at all times, and still an anti-hero though, which is really interesting in the fact that not too many times in movie history or in TV history at this point did the main character have so many villainous traits. And again, James Gandolfini in his choices as Tony Soprano just turned out to be the perfect match. And unfortunately, James Gandolfini was able to finish off his the series as Tony Soprano, but shortly died thereafter in 2013. He died of a heart attack, sadly. I read in my research, actually, his 14-year-old son, Michael, actually found him unconscious and then had to call paramedics, and terrible story. Some of the stuff in the research, kind of sucks, but a little bit more about the show, including James Gandolfini. Like, of course, like I said, he did a few movies before then, but a lot of the other characters and actors that were cast in the show weren't particularly famous. I think that was a choice by David Chase to not go with a lot of, really noteworthy actors. Of course, really talented actors, but then also actors that actually had some experience, whether in real life with organized crime or in other movies. A lot of cast were from Goodfellas, The Godfather, Casino, etc. Which, and I'm talking like, recurring characters that were on the show a lot were in these movies. And it's really interesting because they reference these movies all the time. They talk about watching them. It happened in Suits too. There's a character from The Wire that's also in Suits. And they always reference The Wire in Suits, and no one ever talks about the fact that dude's father-in-law was like a main character in the show. So anyway, I guess this is a small world in Hollywood, so what can you do? But like I said, a lot of these characters did kind of come from some type of interesting experience in the past, which again, David Chase, as you'll find, I'll talk about it more, he was just meticulous in finding these people, and, they went through a lot of different casting choices and made sure that, they picked the right people, and the fact that he wanted a really, really good representation of what these people, of this side of life. And I guess any filmmaker, any TV creator, you're going to try to represent a slice of life in that sense, where you're trying to portray this aspect that is as real as possible without being necessarily too random that it's boring, and still drive a narrative, but have all these elements added to it that it's believable and immersive in that sense. One of the great podcasts right now that I've been listening to is called Talking Sopranos, with Steve Schirripa and Mike Imperioli. These guys are actually both actors from the show. Steve Schirripa playing Bobby Bacala and Michael Imperioli playing Christopher Moltisanti, and big characters in the show. And they both sit there, have a podcast, and they started it during COVID, and they go through every episode. And as of today, when I'm recording this podcast anyway, they haven't gone through all the episodes yet of The Sopranos, and they have guests on. So, if you guys like The Sopranos, go check them out. It's a great podcast. But Steve and Michael have really good insight, background information, kind of unknown stuff, and obviously a lot of like inside acting chops, interesting perspectives, so to speak, coming from Michael and Steve being actually on the show and being directed by some of these people. And again, talking to fellow cast members and also crew people from the crew too, casting directors, the costume specialists, things like that, right? So it's really cool. And again, both these guys, Michael Imperioli and Steve Scrippa, had a little bit of the same kind of idea. They were both kind of in mobster movies here and there. Michael Imperioli was Spider in Goodfellas, and then they get this big opportunity on Sopranos, and it's huge. And it's funny because you kind of get used to these characters on the show, and then it's silly to think like obviously these are just actors; they're not really who they are. But when you see them in this podcast, like Michael couldn't be further from who Chrissy is, and Steve Scrippa sounds very different than Bobby Bacala. And if Steve could ever hear this, I know you're listening anyway. If Steve could hear this, he would agree that he probably wouldn't want to be like Bobby Bacala because Bobby was a little bit dumb. But God bless him anyway. You know what? These characters are so lovable that you feel like you know who they are, and it's interesting, I think growing up where I grew up here in Hamilton, it's a very Italian town. And one of my buddies, Nathan Caranci, shout out Nate if you're listening, asked me once if I was Italian because, you go away to school, especially playing on the football team, you're talking with everybody. And he asked me if I was Italian. I said, no, but I'm from Hamilton, so I might as well be. And just a lot of my friends were Italian. I dated a girl back in high school whose family was extremely Italian. And it was, in my mind, coming from Polish, Eastern European background, it was an interesting look into things. In my mind, I look back and look at her family like as if they were Sopranos. Obviously, they weren't, not even close. But just again, the culture, the hand gestures, the food, everything, is I'd say perfectly represented in the show. And, being at the East Coast, obviously Hamilton isn't, East Coast Canada, but it still has that kind of East Coast vibe. Being on the water, we're 8 hours, but, not that far away from New York State even. And, it's 8 hours from New York City. And, it's like there's a weird connection there. Obviously, the area is very romanticized. But again, Hamilton has a big mob history as well. So it's very interesting, again, how The Sopranos really captured that Italian-American experience, but that's extremely, extremely similar to the Italian-Canadian experience too, which is just tremendous. I was doing a little research into the Talking Sopranos, and they talk about this in their first episode too. But in that podcast I mentioned, Talking Sopranos, they were also inspired to start it because of all the people watching and rewatching during quarantine. I say rewatching because, like myself, I've seen it before, and it's an interesting thing about rewatching shows where, I feel like some people might feel like it's tiresome or it's repetitive, but you always end up seeing something different. And shout out Brian Callen. He said one of the greatest quotes that he quoted from an acting coach: if you don't like a show or a TV or a movie that you've watched, watch it again and then decide. Because if you've only watched something once, you don't really get the opportunity to give it its full potential, because maybe you had maybe you brought something to the experience that might have affected it. But if you watch it again and you really don't like it, then at least you gave it a shot. But I've rewatched things on the second time through and liked it a lot better. I've had every experience for that matter, but I've more than a couple times rewatched a few shows here and there, and Sopranos is definitely on that list as far as rewatchability. But being 2021 and the show came out in 1999, a lot of people were too young to watch it when the show came out, right? So with all these streaming services, it's really given kids and younger adults like an opportunity to watch this show for the first time. And again, it's funny because my first time with it, like I mentioned, I dated a girl back in high school. Her family was very Italian, and unfortunately the relationship didn't end very well. So it was a little bit of a sore spot for me as far as when I watched the first season for the first time. In fact, the first episode for the first time. And this was shortly after, because I think it was back in university when my friend Brian Armstrong, shout out B-Rye, told me about The Sopranos. He said, man, you got to watch it. It's tremendous. Blah, blah, blah. Talked about it. And I had obviously heard about it. It was all, I graduated in 2009. So it wasn't like it had been around. I think technically it was already done and it was no longer airing on TV anymore. By the time I saw it was, I think 2010 or 11 by the time I watched it for the first time. So it was already off air for about 3-4 years. And my buddy B-Rye convinced me to watch it. I watched it, and I had broken up with this girl at the end of high school, and it was still first year when I watched it. And it was just so close to home. It was just breaking my heart to watch it, and it was just too. I was like, man. I told B-Rye, I was like, man, I don't need to watch this show because I lived it, bro. So it took me a while to actually warm up to it and finally watch it again, which is so weird, but once I got over that, it was just so perfect. Like I said, they just nailed everything. And that's what freaked me out the first time, is it's so realistic and it's so interesting. They get the little eccentricities. Again, the hand gestures, the culture. There's so much food in the show. It's funny, Carmela Soprano, played by Edie Falco in the show. Edie Falco does not know how to cook, but Carmela Soprano is constantly cooking, almost cooking in every scene that she's in. So a lot of times they had to kind of come up with creative ways to make it look like she knew what she was actually doing. She said a lot of the shots are from kind of elbow up, so she can just like pretend what she's doing with her hands. But again, really, really interesting in the sense that there's this almost Scarface level of infamy with the show, and I had heard about it, and I knew about it. And there's posters everywhere at the poster sale at school. If you're listening and don't know, a poster sale, like, I'm sure you can deduce what it means, but I think a couple times a year, at my university, they would like clear out this big space in the community center and sell posters, because kids love to put posters up, in there and decorate their student houses and shit. And, you'd see Sopranos posters everywhere with the R as a gun. And I always thought it was like a little bit corny. I'm like, whatever. It's kind of like Scarface. It's kind of like all these, infamous shows. But again, they're infamous for a reason. And I think, again, the show was groundbreaking in the sense that it brought you this anti-hero that was somewhat of a villain that you end up cheering for and you end up rooting for, and he's doing all this terrible shit, and he's cheating on his wife, and he's fucking over, he's killing people and killing people close to him, and breaking all these rules and breaking the law, but you're entranced. And I think, again, that's a lot to do with James Gandolfini's acting skills, but it's also a lot to do with the writing and the fact that I think we have this innate kind of want to feel like we have a connection, and it's a cathartic relationship watching Tony do a lot of the stuff he does too, which is really interesting. A little bit more about the show. You know, the writing on it is so good, and it's funny in you know, you kind of get into different shows obviously as you go on, and maybe some are influenced by others, and maybe some have connections that you never would have thought. But you know, one of my other favorite shows is Mad Men. I love watching Mad Men. You know, it's one of those slow burn shows that, you know, it's a little bit polarizing. Some people aren't so big on it. But one of the producers, Matthew Weiner, and he actually writes a lot on it, on both on Mad Men and The Sopranos. He's produced both shows, and it's really interesting to see, again, both characters. You know, your Don Draper, your Tony Soprano, very interesting. Their connection there, they're very, very similar. You know, handsome dudes. You know, with their life all worked out perfectly, but they still want more. They still crave more. You know, even and still kind of someone you wouldn't actually want to be, because they do dastardly shit, but it's like there's something in them that just makes you want to keep watching, I guess, at least just to keep watching. Another anti-hero, obviously Walter White from Breaking Bad, right? So, but Sopranos was the first to really introduce this anti-hero idea, this villain as the main character. Seems like a little bit of an older trope now, but this is one of the first time it really came through. It was in movies and stuff, of course, but in literature, but of course, you know, just really primetime TV too. And you know, it is HBO. I wanted to mention HBO was very different. It wasn't just cable. Wasn't just primetime TV. This was something really special. It allowed directors and writers to kind of go off and do other things that they wouldn't normally be able to do in regular TV. Another groundbreaking aspect of the show was that Tony actually went to go see a therapist, and they showed a lot of the therapy sessions. Dr. Melfi, who is Tony's therapist, played by Lorraine Bracco. She's also from Goodfellas. They have many scenes together, and really, Tony's the only person that Dr. Melfi really sees from like that main kind of mob crew. But it's not really analyze this, analyze that kind of thing. It's not just, you know, blubbering kind of. It's very interesting, deep conversation. And Lorraine Bracco, the actress who played Dr. Melfi, said that she took some of her inspiration from real psychotherapists that she's had. And, you know, I think the show won awards from psychotherapy associations because such an accurate display of psychoanalysis. And again, this is still early 2000s where therapy, and still to this day, therapy is still stigmatized, right? So, you know, a big, strong, tough, you know, brutish guy has to go start to see this analyst and start to really pick away at what kind of made him who he really is. It was fascinating to people, and still is to this day. One of the truly fascinating aspects of that is that I see, you know, as someone who studies psychology, they mentioned during the show, because it turns out as the show goes on too, that Tony is a sociopath, right? You know, a lot of these people who are in organized crimes, they're sociopathic, like by definition. They don't follow the rules of normal society, but a lot of them go further than that and is pathological. But one of the aspects that's brought up during the show is that sociopaths actually hone their skills in therapy. So they actually go into therapy to strengthen their interpersonal skills, which sociopaths choose, and it's all very strategic in how they interact with others, and they see that this is just one more manipulation, that if they can convince a therapist, then they can convince anyone, which is just an amazing kind of brooding undertone, which again, on a rewatch, and you know this when you rewatch the show, just this brooding undertone, which is just tremendous. One of the cool things is kind of outside the world of outside of the TV show The Sopranos, but still in the world of The Sopranos, I should say, is The Many Saints of Newark. It's a new movie coming out. I don't know if anyone's checked it out yet. It's been in the works forever. COVID kind of like has postponed the date for it tons of times. Shout out Joey Diaz. He's going to be in it. But it's a prequel to the Sopranos show. And it actually surrounds the story of Dickie Moltisanti, which is Christopher Moltisanti's father, who they mention a lot in the show. Dickie Moltisanti was actually Tony's kind of like mentor growing up. Moltisanti in Italian actually means many saints. So many saints of Newark, Moltisanti is of New York. Michael Gandolfini, James Gandolfini's son, is actually playing a young Tony Soprano, which is going to be really interesting. Super cool to see. You know, again, David Chase is a part of this, so it's not going to be half-assed. He's not going to do anything that's not going to be true to the Sopranos and the Sopranos lore. It's going to be really fascinating. You know, I actually heard in Talking Sopranos, actually in the podcast, they mentioned that David Chase first wanted the Sopranos to be a movie. You know, he thought the idea first came to him as a movie, but clearly it worked as a show. So he should know how to write a movie, and I think we're all looking forward to that for sure. But, you know, kind of in conclusion, I think, again, the thing that I love about the show is, and I think many people do, is, of course, Tony. You know, Tony Soprano being this man who kind of lives two lives. He has these two families, his crime family, his family at home. I mean, you can even count the third as his Gumar. He's got side pieces here and there, but he's constantly trying to juggle this, and it's a mirror into I think sometimes the chaos that exists in our own lives. And I think that, you know, like Stolznitsin said, you know, the line between good and evil doesn't run between countries, it runs between the heart of every man. And I think that when we see these characters in literature and in movies and television, we see this reflection, and we it's a little bit like I talked about in the last podcast in about pro wrestling, about that idea about kayfabe, where there's a suspension of disbelief that we are actually separate, but that reflection there actually shows that, hey, I am you and you are me, and there's something there, and there's that catharsis that happens when you get to see Tony do all this wild shit. But it's something that, you know, is unacceptable. A lot of the stuff that Tony Soprano does is unacceptable by society, but we like to see that. It's a vicarious thrill to watch Tony do this again. We simultaneously approve and enjoy, or simultaneously disapprove and enjoy Tony's life. And I think it's, you know, it's what we do as humans, right? We want to watch this, and we want to see what happens when we make different choices, right? And a lot of people want to make good choices and want to go down the righteous path and not stray and not break the law and stuff. So they make TV shows and they make movies like this just to give us a little bit of that break. But, you know, again, it's almost like a car crash, right? Everything that Tony does is abhorrent, but we can't look away. And, you know, it's something that I think people don't always explore, that side of them, that little bit darkness, that shadow, as Carl Jung would call it. But, you know, if you really look into these shows, that's what they want you to explore. That, you know, we're not far away from someone like Tony Soprano. Actually, we are that same person. We are all connected, but, you know, don't forget that, and the fact that, you know, we have the ability to, just like Tony, you know, create a life that we want and do our thing. But yet at the same time, we also have the ability to make the wrong choices and go down a darker path. And at the same time, we can take the lighter path and continue on. But there's balance to everything, and we can never, you know, we can never have light without dark, and we need to give our attention to it in the sense, and and nod to it. Don't give a lot of credence and a lot of power into that darkness, but know that it's there just as well as the light is. And it's not necessarily evil or bad, but in the sense that you need to, explore that. Don't be afraid of it. It's part of you. It's part of all of us. But it will only strengthen the lighter parts. It will only make things better. And again, this is TV. This is art. This is people's expression of the inner mind. And when you can see this in a TV show, when things like this do happen, it becomes amazing. And again, it's a tremendous show. One of my favorites of all time. The characters, not only Tony Soprano, but so many, explore these different aspects of life, and there's love, and there's tension, and there's small little bits of life that you would never think someone would put into a TV show, but they do. And it's a little bit of a slow burn to start, but if you want to get into it, start watching it. It's available in a lot of different places. I want to hear from you. If you guys have never watched it, shout us out. Let us know that you're watching. It's a great show. There's nothing really else that makes you feel, that kind of connection to a character once you're finished watching that show. And it has a really interesting ending that's very controversial. I didn't even want to get into it today, but maybe someday we might revisit things. But again, like I said, it's a perfect time to rewatch it, get back into it. People are getting into it. Jump in the way with 2 feet. Make sure you're not wearing cement shoes. Unbelievable show. Again, go check it out. If you liked what you heard today, please rate the podcast. Reach out to us if you want to hear anything different. If you got any comments about anything, I want to hear about some of your guys' favorite characters. Support the podcast, patreon.com/the Bigmark podcast. Shout us out, Twitter, Instagram at the Bigmark podcast. Again, we love you. Thank you so much for listening. I can't wait to do another episode for you guys. And again, go out there and get some gabagool. Hey.